They say some empires rise on gold, others on blood. The one Charles Ponzi built rose on a promise of impossible returns, delivered with the poise of a well-dressed stranger and the poetry of numbers. In a single winter, he turned the dream of easy wealth into a national mania. In a single summer, he turned that dream into rubble. How does one man transform a rational market into a fever? How did an obscure immigrant with a checkered past create a financial model so simple and so beguiling that thousands handed him their life savings? This is the story of ambition, timing, human hope, and the structural cracks that let a conman write his name across the world. The story of Charles Ponzi, and of the scheme that would bear his name forever. Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi arrived in Boston in 1903 after a transient life in Europe and South America. He was young, charismatic, articulate in several languages, qualities that work as well on stage as they do in business. He presented himself as a man of ideas, a man who knew finance, could speak of postal regulations, and could translate foreign opportunity into American wealth. The myth of Ponzi's origin is itself instructive. A self-fashioned story of upward mobility, a narrative that Americans of that era were primed to believe. Ponzi tried his hand at many things: peddling products, silvering spoons, selling real estate schemes and venture ideas. He failed often and spectacularly. He was arrested for forgery in Canada in 1903 and spent time in debtors' prisons. He lied to get jobs. He charmed people with improbable promises. But failure taught him two lessons: how to read people and how to tell stories that sounded credible. By the time World War I ended, the world was awash in financial disorder. Currencies surged and crashed. International mail systems reeled with inflation and exchange rate chaos. For a man with imagination and a flair for numbers, it was raw material. For the populace, still reeling from war and influenza, hungry for security, it was the perfect moment for a promise that sounded like certainty. The kernel of Ponzi's plan was technical and, on the surface, mundane. The International Reply Coupon, IRC. An IRC was a small postal instrument used to prepay postage for a reply to international letters. Before the war, IRCs were a stable, low-value mechanism. Buy one in country A, it could be exchanged for postage in country B. The concept was simple: buy cheap where value is lower, redeem where it's higher, and arbitrage. Ponzi argued that because of wartime fluctuations in currency values and postage rates, an IRC bought in one country could be redeemed in another for substantially more. If he bought IRCs in bulk where they were cheap and exchanged them elsewhere, he claimed the profit margins would be enormous. The math sounded clean. The pitch sounded respectable. This was not gambling or secrecy. This was postal arbitrage, a novel financial innovation disguised as savvy commerce. Here was the genius and the tragedy of Ponzi's brilliance. He attached a technical, plausible-sounding mechanism to a human craving, the craving for predictable, outsized returns. He promised 50% profit in 45 days. For the starving middle class and the speculative rich, that promise was not merely alluring, it was intoxicating. Ponzi did not merely sell a product, he sold confidence. He rented a modest office, printed professional stationery, and hired well-dressed clerks. He walked into bank lobbies and foreign exchange offices with precise talk and an accent that made him sound like an insider. He used terms, revenue, arbitrage, postage returns, that framed him as a sophisticated financier rather than a gambler. He crafted examples with numbers, tables, and friendly arithmetic to make the improbable appear inevitable. The mechanics of his operation were far less ornate than his rhetoric. Ponzi would accept cash from investors, often people who could not afford risk but could not resist the lure of quick gains, and give them a signed receipt promising their return. For weeks, he paid earlier investors with the capital of later ones. Each payout became proof: a satisfied investor, a testimonial, a referral. This manufactured credibility fed growth. Word spread, first in immigrant communities and small clubs, then across Boston, then across America. Ponzi's timing was perfect. Banks were distrusted after wartime instability. Posters of savings bonds and government securities offered modest returns. People wanted more. Ponzi offered a structured miracle: consistent high yields, with the appearance of a legitimate mechanism behind them. He dressed certainty in the language of finance. Panic and mania are siblings. Ponzi's office filled with depositors who queued for a chance to hand him cash. Newspapers, smelling a headline, began reporting on the man who pays 50%. Investors brought everything: savings, inheritances, the proceeds from home sales. Ponzi's bank ledger showed a dizzying expansion. He could not buy enough IRCs to match the inflows. He had become the market. Demand for his returns outstripped any real method of generating the promised profits. His flamboyant showmanship fed the phenomenon. He threw money at publicity, dinners, small charity events, and his image became public theater, a modern Midas in reverse. The city itself became complicit. Shopkeepers and clerks could recite his returns like scripture. For many, investing with Ponzi became a social ritual, a badge of belonging to a winner. But growth hides structural weaknesses. Ponzi's model needed constant new capital. IRC arbitrage could not possibly supply the profits he promised at the scale he required. The math failed. To keep up with payouts, he needed exponentially increasing new investors. And when that growth rate slowed, everything would crumble. Still, the moment belonged to Ponzi. For months, the scheme operated in full view, and the public either believed or wanted to believe. The genius part of Ponzi's con was that it made his collapse happen slowly, long enough to accumulate both wealth and attention, short enough to catch people emotionally invested in his continued success. Newspapers loved Ponzi. The Boston Post, the Boston Globe, and other papers published stories that magnified his image. Early profiles emphasized the ingenuity of postal arbitrage. They ran human interest pieces about depositors who met their life-changing returns. The press did what Ponzi could not do alone. It legitimized him. Every headline was a new cohort of believers. But journalism is a double-edged sword. After he became a public figure, scrutiny increased. Rival reporters and skeptical financial analysts started asking questions no longer about Ponzi's charisma but about his ledgers. Where were the massive IRC purchases he claimed? Why couldn't anyone verify shipments? Why did his office appear to have stacks of receipts but no evidence of the postal volume required? The crescendo came when investigative reporters began comparing his claims with postal records. An intrepid reporter, digging into accounting and international mail ledgers, found discrepancies. The promised IRC arbitrage could not account for the money Ponzi had taken. The receipts were real enough. They were just receipts for nothing of tangible value. When the first public doubts began to appear in print, the scheme's fragile architecture began to fracture. Investors rushed to redeem their certificates. Ponzi, whose operation depended on new funds to pay old ones, hit the wall. A bank run for a capitalist era. Ponzi's collapse was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. People arrived at his office demanding cash. He paid many to maintain the illusion, but the flow of new deposits slowed. With the weight of thousands of claims pressing down, his cash reserves could not keep pace. Suspicion hardened into panic. Federal and postal inspectors investigated. They uncovered the truth with the sober, unvarnished arithmetic of fraud. Deposits far exceeded any feasible profit from IRC exchange, and his purchases of IRCs were minuscule compared to the capital he held. In other words, Ponzi had been using new investors' money to pay earlier investors, the pattern that would later define every Ponzi scheme. The legal apparatus moved. Indictments for mail fraud, for financial deception, for operating a fraudulent business. Ponzi was arrested in August 1920. The public, which had once received him as a miracle worker, turned quickly to scorn. Those who had lost everything confronted him in court and on the street. His empire, a house of receipts, charisma, and borrowed time, collapsed into an open ledger and a charged silence. To watch Ponzi in front of a judge was to watch Act 2 of the con. The defendant becomes a spectacle. He defended himself with the same rhetorical flourish that had built his empire. He blamed misunderstandings, regulatory ignorance, and the complexities of international postal accounting. He painted himself as a man of good intentions outmaneuvered by bureaucratic blindness. Yet the facts were stubborn. Financial records mapped the flow of money with ruthless clarity. Witnesses testified about trust betrayed and savings lost. The jury, and later the public, had little patience for the charm that had once been Ponzi's shield. Ponzi was convicted, sentenced to years in prison. He would later be deported to Italy, where he died alone, far from the American stage he once dominated. He left behind a trail of ruined lives and a new word, Ponzi scheme, which would enter the financial lexicon as shorthand for frauds that live off new investors. The man and the scheme became inseparable in the public imagination, even as the mechanics of such scams would continue to appear in new forms. Anyone telling this story must ask, why did Ponzi's scheme work? Why do such scams recur across time and culture? At the heart of every Ponzi scheme is a simple psychological architecture. First, there is scarcity and desire. After the chaos of World War I, people craved stability and opportunity. A fixed, large return seems rational in a world of uncertain banks and volatile markets. Ponzi weaponized that craving. Second, there is authority by association. Ponzi cloaked his operation in plausible technical detail, postal instruments, international exchange, and in professional trappings. Clothing, office, clerks, and advertisements created signals that said, "Trust me." Human brains often infer honesty from presentation. Ponzi understood this and exploited it. Third, there is social proof. Early investors paid off. Those early payouts generated testimonials, referrals, and a contagion effect. When your neighbor makes a fortune overnight, skepticism recedes. Fourth, there is the complexity of verification. When schemes cloak themselves in technical jargon or operate across borders, they make verification expensive and difficult. That opacity buys time. Finally, Ponzi took advantage of regulatory gaps. The financial oversight architecture of the early 20th century was ill-equipped to handle a scheme that relied on postal instruments and cash transactions. By the time regulators caught on, Ponzi had already converted trust into dispersed losses. Understanding these mechanics is not merely academic. It is cautionary. The combination of social pressure, plausible complexity, and human eagerness creates conditions where even reasonable people can be led to irrational faith. The label Ponzi scheme is a cultural echolocation call. It tells us immediately the scheme's basic structure, but the label also flattens nuance. Not every financial fraud is a textbook Ponzi scheme. Not every Ponzi is identical. Some variants rely on commodities, others on real estate, yet the structural vulnerability that payouts rely on new capital remains the same. Ponzi's name carried social scorn, but the phenomenon forced changes. Regulators and journalists sharpened their tools. Audits, postal checks, and cross-border financial cooperation gained new urgency. Lawmakers wrote stricter fraud statutes and sought better mechanisms for consumer protection. Journalists took on an expanded role as the city's early warning system. In that sense, Ponzi's collapse was a civic lesson. And yet, the aftershocks were complicated. Many who had once praised Ponzi for his ingenuity now grappled with the shame of loss. Others, unrepentant, maintained that conventional finance was the true thief. Conspiracy and scapegoating followed. Still, the simplest truth remained. Millions had been harmed by a scheme that made human hope its raw material. If Charles Ponzi were alive today, he would not recognize the tech, but he would recognize the sentiment. Modern variants of his scheme appear as multi-level marketing scams, dubious hedge funds, and even some crypto projects. Each reinvention dresses the ancient structure in modern clothes. Tokenomics, viral referral systems, and opaque governance are today's jargon for the same human vulnerabilities. Regulators, too, have adapted. The Securities and Exchange Commission and criminal prosecutors use forensic accounting, blockchain tracing, and international cooperation to trace flows of money. Yet every structural innovation in finance invites new fraud models. Markets are a cat-and-mouse game. As oversight improves, scammers evolve. So the story of Ponzi is not merely historical. It is continual. It asks a question relevant to every era. How do we balance innovation and skepticism? How do we keep the fluid creativity of markets without allowing predators to feed on collective optimism? We should end not with the man or the model but with the people. Names and numbers can flatten suffering. Behind Ponzi's receipts were families. A teacher who handed over her savings for a new kitchen. An immigrant who accepted Ponzi's promise as a bridge to citizenship security. An elderly couple who cashed their pension. For many, the loss was not just financial, it was reputational, bodily, and sometimes terminal. People sold homes, fought divorces, and fought for the dignity to claim what little was left. When Ponzi was convicted, many felt vindicated. But justice rarely repairs lives. The courts could punish an individual, but they could not reconstruct lost decades. Charles Ponzi's story is taut and tragic. A man who built a colossus of paper out of human longing, and who watched it collapse under its own weight. The term Ponzi scheme entered our lexicon as both indictment and caution. It reminds us that even in regulated economies, the architecture of fraud can be elegant and devastating. The final image is not of Ponzi in a courtroom or of an overflowing chest of money, but of a city that believed a promise and paid for it. Beneath the flash and photograph, the lesson stands. Any promise that seems to produce wealth without corresponding economic activity should be met with skepticism. Easy returns are rarely earned. They are often transferred, redistributed from the many to the few. Ponzi did not invent greed. He simply learned to package it brilliantly. And because his name is now shorthand for a certain kind of deception, every time a new scam emerges, people will reach back to his story, not to Leonize a conman, but to remember how fragile trust can be and how costly its betrayal. If you love this story, like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more interesting educational stories.